Today, I'm in Southport via the ferry. That's my favorite thing about going to Southport is taking the ferry. So I am right on the edge of the Cape Fear River here. Oak Island Lighthouse is just right there. So I invite you to hear this word of the Lord from 2 Samuel chapter 6. This is a really great passage. I invite you now to hear it. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the household of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were there carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all of his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in the place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of the Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he had appointed me ruler of the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." I'm here on the south end of Southport. There's like all these great restaurants here. It's a cool place to hang out. Again, the lighthouse is just right over there. King David in this passage, wow. There's a lot of backstory here, but to make a long story short, basically, King David has recovered the ark. He is bringing it into Jerusalem, and he has plans for it. This ark, which is not just a symbol of the presence of God, it is the literal presence of God. I think about Indiana Jones at the very end of that movie. If you remember the German SS soldiers, they look inside the ark and they say, "It's so beautiful." And then their faces literally melt. The power that resides in this ark is unfathomable. And it was going to be the centerpiece of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that he was building. And within this ark, they would create the Holy of Holies, the temple would go around it, and it would be the epicenter of everything. All of life would revolve around this ark. So David, this was a pivotal moment, the ushering of the ark in Jerusalem. And so it required a level of joy that was unprecedented, a level of dancing that was unprecedented. He was the king. And so what he does is he dances in a very undignified way. And he's not wearing a lot of clothes, and as his body is kind of flailing around, he's sort of exposing himself. His wife, who the scriptures say that he loved dearly, his wife admonishes him and says, "You have embarrassed yourself, you've embarrassed the country, you exposed yourself to other women." She was furious. He said, "No, this is worth it. This moment right here is worth it. I will dance even more undignified than the way I'm dancing right now." There was a freedom to David. What David did was undignified, but he felt the moment required it. There was a freedom to David that I actually quite admire. Hearing this story, it's like looking into a mirror, because in the Christian church, there's not a lot of freedom. I've been in churches where people have complained about dwindling attendance or lack of interest or whatever, and it seems like they always sort of place the blame on younger generations, like it's It's secular culture, it's politics, it's it's video games, whatever. It's never the church's fault. It's always the generation before them. And I've heard that over and over again. And we need to look in the mirror. We need to see the freedom that David has in this passage and understand that while the church does many things right, we do some very important things quite wrong. There is a Christian culture that resides in many churches, a culture where you have to kind of stay in this lane. You have to keep everyone happy. You got to keep the peace. And it seems like that in Christian churches, the only people really talking about things that are meaningful, people who really drive conversations, are those who are the loudest and those who are the angriest. And that's not what's healthy. Those of us who are kind of in the minority in that regard, they get very frustrated. I was in a meeting one time, and I was trying to be a moderator for a tough conversation we were having in a church, and I was trying to keep the peace, keep everyone happy, just being a neutral moderator. And the meeting, there was a lot of people there, and the meeting ended up with a lot of shouting. There was a small group of people who were shouting and yelling and waving a Bible around, and the rest of us were just like, it was heartbreaking. It was the kind of meeting that drives people away from the Christian church. Seems like the angriest and the loudest are the ones that drive the conversation. The rest of us, we just sort of shy away. We feel alienated. We feel like we don't belong anymore. Yeah, I was recently looking inside of a mirror, not my own mirror at home. It's not about my body. I hope we all feel good with our bodies. It was a spiritual mirror that I felt like God was holding up to me. A couple months ago, I was asking myself, if I weren't a pastor, would I want myself as a pastor? What kind of pastor would I want? Would I want myself as a pastor? And the answer to that was no, I don't think I would. I was reading an article recently about what makes for a good late night television show host. Why are guys like Johnny Carson, Jay Leno, Jimmy Fallon, what made those guys so successful? What is the number one trait that makes for a good late night host? And they said, undoubtedly, the number one trait is that they don't have to be really funny necessarily. They just have to be really likable people. Really likable. You look at a guy like Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Fallon is an incredibly likable guy. He's just a fun, likable guy. And I think I often misunderstand my role here at church, which is to keep everyone happy. Make sure everyone is liking me and liking the church, and just put out fires when I see them and keep things smooth and running. But in truth, that's not leading like Jesus. That's not living like Jesus. We're not called to just be people pleasers, to keep everyone happy. What I admire so much in David in this story is that he's free. He knows that his dance may offend people. He probably knew it might even offend his wife, but he believed it was worth it. He knew someone would be offended, but he believed that this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I should do, I'm going to do it. Christ lived the same way. Name a single moment when Christ was afraid to speak up. Name a single moment when Christ punted instead of throwing for the end zone. Name a single moment when Christ didn't say what needed to be said. Christ always did. He never shied away. That's living and leading like Christ. More recently, I've discovered that instead of being liked, the best way to sleep well at night, the best way to look inside the mirror and be pleased with yourself and be pleased with the person that God is calling you to be, is to live and lead like Christ, to have that same freedom that David had, to be yourself and to trust that you won't be judged for that. If you were in the Christian church about 25 years ago, you may remember there were these youth ministers who made popular these bracelets, and it had on them WWJD, what would Jesus do? And we were all 25 years ago pondering what would Jesus do. I had a glow-in-the-dark bracelet, what would Jesus do? And it's always an important question. How would Jesus live? What would Jesus do? When you look into the mirror, are you behaving like Christ? There are these two titans of theology several hundred years ago. One was named Anselm, and he believed in this thing called the substitutionary theory of atonement, which is that Christ was the substitute for us on the cross. And when we look to the cross, we have immense gratitude for Christ taking our place on the cross and dying for our sins. But then there is another contemporary of his, a younger contemporary, called Peter Abelard. He said, look, the cross is not just this thing that we look to and be grateful for. The cross is this thing that we look to and we're inspired about how to live ourselves. Christ was showing us through the cross how to live. It's called the moral influence theory. Peter Abelard made this famous, and he said that when we look to the cross, we are called to live and to lead like Christ. If you subscribe to that, which I think all of us do, then our hope is that we live a cross-shaped life, which means that we live with no fear. We say and do what we believe Christ would want, and we live with no fear about that. And if we are persecuted, if someone does, send us a mean email or whatever, we just move on and we say, look, we're living the way that Christ wanted us to, and that's part of life. Sometimes we get a little persecuted. Sometimes we ruffle some feathers. Sometimes someone waves a Bible in our face or whatever. A cross-shaped life. Are you living a cross-shaped life? When you look at yourself in a mirror, are you living a cross-shaped life? Looking out into the river, I'm thinking of a couple things that Christians can do within the church right now today that would make the church better for all people. And I can do this too. I'm starting to. First of all, we need to be ourselves in church. For so long, I felt like I couldn't be myself, even as the pastor of the church, for fear of being judged, for fear of upsetting other people. But you know what? We can't have that fear. David had no fear. Christ had no fear. Be yourself. Say what you believe. Be who you are. Be yourself. And don't have any fear about what someone will say or judge you for. The second thing is this, and this is the most important thing. If you're being yourself in church, then we need to love and respect those who are being themselves too and saying how they feel. Don't be that loud, angry person who waves the Bible around. And also, don't be afraid of those people too. Don't let them dominate. Love and respect them, but love and respect those who disagree with you too. That's a church for all people. People come to church because they want to experience freedom. So let's make sure they have that freedom in church to be who they are. And let's love them and respect them for who they are. I desire for Harbor and for any church to be a church where people can dance freely and not be judged for how they dance. If we can be that church, we can be a growing, thriving church. A church that people want to be a part of. A church where people can come and dance freely and know they'll be accepted for who they are and how they dance. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Oh, to see the dawn of the darkest day, Christ on the road to Calvary, tried by sinful men, torn and beaten there, nailed to a cross of wood. This the power of the cross. Christ became